Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Most Christians accept Sunday as the New Testament Lord's Day. The Jews observe the seventh-day Sabbath. Muslims observe Friday. Some religions observe no day. But does it make any difference which day we observe the fourth commandment?
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Most people believe it makes no difference which day we observe the Sabbath command, or whether we even keep it at all. It wasn't always this way. During the first, second, and third centuries of the Christian era, millions of people were tortured and even killed over the question of which day to observe the Sabbath. Back then, it was a serious life and death matter. But today, well, we just go along with what everyone else is doing without giving much thought to what God thinks or what it actually says in the Bible. Of course, if there is no God and the Bible is just the work of mortal men, then it certainly does not matter which day we observe. But there is a God, and the Holy Bible is His authoritative Word. You can prove that for yourself, and once you do, then it matters which day we observe the Sabbath. As Herbert W. Armstrong wrote in Which Day is the Christian Sabbath, God is emphatically in the picture, whether a man recognizes that fact or not. That great God has set in living, inexorable motion, invisible laws respecting this very question. That God and those laws exist, he wrote. They live. They are active, and their existence and their action do not depend on one man or all mankind realizing their existence. Let's continue our study in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 1 and verse 21. And they went into Capernaum, and straightway on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught. Now this is right after Jesus selected His 12 disciples, and notice the first thing that He does, for the most part, is head right into the synagogue on the Sabbath. The reason why there's so much in the Bible about the Sabbath in relation to Jesus Christ, as I think most people are aware of, is because He kept the Sabbath. He observed the Sabbath. Now people veer off track because they think that later on He authorized the change from Saturday to Sunday, which He didn't. But first, let's establish what Jesus Himself did. He's the example that we're to follow, as Paul said. Follow me as I follow Christ. And so what did Jesus Christ do? How did He observe the fourth commandment? That's important to establish firstly. You can look at Luke 4 and verse 16 on your own time, where it says this was His custom to go in and to keep the Sabbath on the seventh day. Verse 38, staying here in Mark 1, it says, And He said unto them, Let us go into the next towns, that I may preach there also, for therefore came I forth. And He preached in their synagogues and throughout all Galilee, and cast out demons. So here He did this each week, preaching in those synagogues on the Sabbath day, on the seventh-day Sabbath. And then a little later in the story, Mark chapter 2, we find that Jesus and His disciples are walking through a cornfield, and it happens to be on the Sabbath day. Verse 23 it says, And it came to pass that He went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and His disciples began, as they went, to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said unto Him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? So here were the Pharisees following Him around to make sure that He kept the Sabbath the way that they thought that He should. They had all kinds of carnal customs that they added to God's law. They kept the Sabbath the way men said it should be kept. Jesus, of course, kept it the way God commanded. There's a difference. Verse 27, And He said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Now read that again. If you haven't gotten your Bible, get it now and follow along and see what God's Word says. See it for yourself. Read that passage again there in Mark 2, right at the end of chapter 2, verses 27 through 28. It says there that the Sabbath was made. We'll see that in just a second over in Genesis 1. God made it. God made the Sabbath. And notice that it was made for man, period. Man in general, not just Jews, not just a certain religion, but it was made for man. Let's note that in Genesis chapter 1. It says over there in Mark that Jesus Christ is the Lord of the Sabbath. He made the Sabbath, and He made it for us, for mankind, all of mankind. The word Sabbath or Sabbaths is mentioned 172 times throughout the Bible. 60 of those references is right in the New Testament, in the very section of the Bible that many believe that God did away with the Sabbath, that God changed the day to the first day of the week. It's God's Sabbath, though. God established it. God made it. God created it from the very beginning. Verse 25 of Genesis 1, and God made the beasts of the earth after His kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth after His kind, and God saw that it was good. So here are these first 6 days of creation, or recreation, as God prepared the surface of the earth for man's existence. And we come then to the beasts of the field that God made. Verse 26 says, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. The plants were made after the plant kind, the animals after the animal kind. And then God said, God and the Word together, in discussing this, they said, let us make man after our kind. Let us make man after the God kind. That word image there in verse 26 has to do with the character of God. This is what God was reproducing, His own character, His own nature in man. Ultimately, that's His goal, that's His objective. Of course, we have a part in that too, in subjecting ourselves to God's will so that He can finish that creation in us. Now look at chapter 2, verse 1. It says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended His work which He had made, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work which He had made. So on the very next day, God, it says, stopped working, but He did not stop creating. The creating continued. There were actually 7 days during that creation week. Not 6, 7. He continued right on creating. And He created the Sabbath on that seventh day. It says there that He made, or that He created the Sabbath, and He hallowed this day. He made it holy by not working on this day. Not because He needed rest, in the sense that we need rest because we're physical beings, but He did rest, and He was refreshed, it says in Exodus 31. We'll see that later as well. He was refreshed by resting, by establishing His presence in this one day, this special day that He made for man. What a refreshing day it was for God, and what a refreshing day it should be for you, if you'll observe it, if you'll keep it the way God commanded for it to be kept. I mean, here's if you just follow the chronology from chapter 1 right through to chapter 2, it's as if God is saying, right after He brought Adam into existence, along with his wife then later, it's as if God is saying, all right, now the first major lesson that I want to teach these two is that I created the Sabbath day for them. I made it for them. I've got to teach them about my Sabbath, because if I'm going to reproduce my character in them, they're going to need to know about how to observe this commandment. And certainly if we observe this command the way God commands it to be kept, it will draw us closer to God. That's a blessing. That's a wonderful blessing. Verse 3 says, and God blessed the seventh day. God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it He had rested from all His work which God created and made. So this day, unlike the 6 days before it, this day is the day that God blessed. God put a special blessing upon this day. Turn over to Exodus 16. Exodus chapter 16, we'll just keep following through some of the chronology that we have time to cover here. But look, this is well before Mount Sinai. This is in Genesis 2. Genesis chapter 2. And then later in Genesis, you find that Abraham kept the Sabbath. He observed the Sabbath day. And then you move forward in the story with the Israelites here in Exodus chapter 16. I'll just leave it to you to study Leviticus 23, verses 1 through 3 on your own time. It says over there that the Sabbath is a day of rest, a Sabbath of rest. God put His presence in this day. God's presence is in the Sabbath. And as I said at the start, I mean, He calls it a holy convocation. This is not something that man can just shove aside and say, well, I think we'll change the day. As I said at the start, people died to observe the right day. People were put to death when they observed the right day. If you go back far enough in the history, I mean, this was a contentious life and death struggle for people. And how come people today can be so blasé about it and not really stand up and say, well, let's look into this question? I mean, this is a serious question to consider. It's just as serious today as it was back in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. God says it does matter which day is made holy. If God did it, then our job, as the commandment says, is to keep it that way. If He made it holy, then our responsibility is not to change it or to shove it aside. It's to keep it the way God made it. To keep it the way He designed it to be. Exodus 16:5, and it shall come to pass that on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Here's where God first rained down manna from heaven. And here again, this too. This is before Mount Sinai. That comes a little bit later. But God says to them when He was raining this down from heaven that here's the way I want you to organize your week. You gather it on the 1st day, 2nd day, 3rd day, 4th day, 5th day, 6th day. And on the 6th day, I'll send a double portion so that you have enough for the Sabbath so you don't have to go out and gather it all up on the 7th day. On that day, you can rest the way God commanded. Look at verse 23. It says, this is from the Moffat version, this is what the eternal means. Tomorrow is to be a day of complete rest, a Sabbath sacred to the eternal. So bake or boil today as you please, and keep what is left over until tomorrow morning. It does take a little extra work of preparing on the 6th day in order to get the full measure of refreshment out of the 7th day. You see that too in Exodus 20 in the full command, as we'll read in a moment, verse 27, and it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the 7th day for to gather, and they found none. They went out and they broke the 7th day command. They decided they knew more than God. They decided that it didn't matter which day they went out to work or that they didn't go to work. Verse 28, and the Lord said unto Moses, how long refuse you to keep my commandments and my laws? These weren't the laws of Moses. These were God's laws, and God was offended by this. And God said to Moses, how long are these people going to disobey my clear command? I mean, really? How can you reason your way around it? It does matter what God thinks because He made it. He's the one who commanded it. He's the one who established it from the beginning. Verse 29, see, for that the Lord has given you the Sabbath, therefore He gives you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide you every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. See, that God miraculously made it possible for the manna to be preserved for that 2-day period, just so that they wouldn't go out and break the 4th commandment on the Sabbath. Now chapter 20, Exodus chapter 20.